Glad that you did that. Well, as was mentioned earlier, probably you already know, today is the Sunday, at least within our society, that we celebrate as Mother's Day. And basically, we've set aside a day, I guess, within our society to celebrate, everything that our mothers do for us here in this life. And of course, I guess all of us have mothers, like Lanny said, that's why we're here, but we understand, the priceless things that they do in our life and the role that they play within our family and within our society. And I always find it difficult as a preacher, what do you say on a day like today? I know you don't necessarily have to preach a lesson that involves mothers on Sunday just because we observe it in our society, but it's almost expected, I guess you could say, of us to recognize that. And it's not a bad thing, because the Bible does recognize the importance of mothers and the role that they play, again, within our families and our societies. And so, a day like today, I think people, even myself, you have higher expectations than usual. I think one preacher, he summed up the expectations of his congregation. He had an older lady of the church who was a very outspoken individual. And Saturday, before Mother's Day, she came to him and she said, "Preacher, tomorrow I'm bringing my mother to church." And she said, "I don't care what you preach about, but it better include mothers and it better be good." And I think that's kind of the expectation that we have. If we're going to talk about mothers today, it better be something good, hasn't it? But we're going to do something a little bit different. As you probably noticed, I don't have a PowerPoint this morning because I'm going to try something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, at least for me. I'm not going to have a 3-point alliterated sermon this morning or a highly organized PowerPoint outline. And actually, the lesson itself doesn't really have individual points that we're going to divide up and look at. But it is a story that I'd like to look at today from God's Word to share with you about a day in the life of a mother. And the mother that I want, I guess it's more the day that we'll be looking at, but an event, maybe we should say, in the life of a mother. And the mother that I want to concentrate on this morning is Mary, the mother of Jesus. And if you have your Bibles, turn over with me to Luke chapter 2. And that's where we're going to read that story, at least toward the end of the chapter there, starting in about verse 41. And as you're turning over there, I'll remind you of one of the things. I know I say this a lot, but I really do truly mean it. One of the greatest problems, I guess, that I have in reading and studying about these Bible characters is to connect them to reality. To think about them as ordinary, everyday people just like you and just like me. But that's what they were. I mean, they were extraordinary people. Yes, they were very spiritual individuals, but they were mothers, just like some of you are. They were fathers. They were children. They were grandparents. I mean, the same things that we experience in life, they had to experience too. And so what I want to try to do as we read this story this morning is I want to try to connect the reality of being a mother. And I know I'm not a mother, but I want to kind of connect the reality of that with Mary as we're reading about her here in this story of Jesus. And to try to think like a mother would think and react like a mother would react. One of the things that probably, if you don't know it, you should. Mothers are really good at multitasking. You ever notice that? And what I mean by that is, they do all these different things during the day, and somehow they're still able to carry on their own agenda that they have, their own mission. And that's very commendable quality to have. To be able not only to accomplish things for yourself, but also be able to accomplish things for other people during life. And so that's just one of the traits that mothers have. And I would imagine, the Bible doesn't say this, but I would imagine that Mary, as a mother, had that same ability. You think about Joseph. Well, what did Joseph do, her husband? Well, he was a carpenter. And so he was probably busy a lot of times in his life, working with wood. I can imagine he had projects that he worked on at home, and while he's busy doing all these things and trying to create a living for the family, then you have Mary, caught up with the task of being a mother. And so she has to think about, well, do we have enough food in the house, for this day or for the rest of the week? Are the children, do they have enough clothes for this week? What are they going to wear tomorrow? Things like that, just ordinary things that we as husbands and males don't really think about a lot. You think about preparing for social engagements. Did they ever have anybody over to their home? Well, if they were ordinary people, which they were, I'm sure that they did. And so she would have had to prepare for things like that too. And of course, then you have the 100 other tasks, that a mother has to do every day of her life. But we want to look at Luke chapter 2 here, and beginning about verse 41. Now, it's actually describing the life of Jesus here, but I want to kind of go through these verses and again, break them down and think about them from the standpoint of a mother and how this event in the life of Mary affected her as a mother. In verse 41, it says, "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast." Well, we read about in this passage how Mary and Joseph, they were in the habit of traveling every year to Jerusalem to observe the feast of the Passover. Well, we studied a couple Wednesday nights ago. We studied the three main feasts under the Old Testament law that God commanded all the male Jews to attend. One of them was the Feast of the Passover. And so if you were a faithful Jew, and there's kind of some, sketchiness as to whether females were actually commanded or required by law to come up, or only if it were the males. But when you read about a lot of these faithful Jewish wives, you'll read about people like Hannah, who come up with their husband at the time of the feast. You read about Mary here, who accompanies her husband Joseph as they journey toward observing this great commandment of God. But this particular year was kind of a big deal because it involved the age of Jesus. Jesus is now 12 years old. And Jewish tradition tells us that it was at 12 years of age, the male children were then required to attend these festivals. And so what we're reading about here is probably the first time that Jesus is taking this journey along with his people. Now, you'll not find a scripture to verify that age. I'm just saying that's what Jewish tradition tells us. And it's interesting that it mentions, Jesus being along or accompanying his parents at this particular year. And so think about it from the standpoint of a family, of taking a child, and this is really what we would probably consider a mini vacation here. You're going to travel away from home, you're going with all the family, and you're going to take your children to see something new. There's a lot of places that he probably hasn't seen yet. There are a lot of people that he hasn't met, a lot of acts that he doesn't understand yet. And so there are a lot of new things that are going to be introduced to Jesus as a young child here. And so when we think about this journey in verse 41, we just think about Jesus and his mom and his dad going to Jerusalem. But if you go down to verse 44, it's a much bigger adventure than that. Because it mentions there in verse 44, as they're returning back, they're coming back with all their family, with all their relatives, and with all their friends or acquaintances. And so what you have there is you have this picture. In fact, there's some versions that translate it as a caravan, and that's probably what it was. It wasn't just one family traveling by themselves to Jerusalem, but it was this entire extended family that was gathered all together, and then you had some of your close friends who would have accompanied you along this journey. And if you study the distance between Nazareth and Jerusalem is about 70 miles, so it's a pretty good journey. And if you know anything about traveling in those days, it wasn't the safest things to do to travel in a small number. And so what a lot of people did when they were traveling, especially if they were carrying goods or valuables or going a very long distance, they would travel in a larger group because that created safety. And also, it would provide companionship too. And so when they go down, it's not just Jesus and his mother and his father. It's the whole extended family that's going with him, along with some of their closest friends. And you can imagine, again, what all that involved with the number of families. I don't know how many of you have ever been on a vacation with a family, with some of your extended family, or maybe with some of your close friends, but it's a little bit different atmosphere than going by yourself. There's a lot of different situations and opportunities that are created by that. And so we go down to verse 43 here in Luke 2. It says, when they had fulfilled the days, and as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem. And Joseph and his mother knew not of it. Now, again, you stop and you think, how could they start back and don't know that Jesus isn't with them? Well, they're not traveling by themselves. Keep that in mind. In verse 44, it says, but they, supposing him to have been in the company, went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance. And when they found him not, they turned back again to Jerusalem, seeking him. Well, I'm trying to imagine here in my own mind what this adventure is like. And I'm picturing all of my extended family and all of my wife's extended family, and I'm thinking about our close friends and what it would be like to set out together on foot or on animal to this tremendous occasion and feast that's taking place at Jerusalem. And I imagine, and you can probably appreciate this, what are children going to be doing? Well, they're not going to be sitting there by mom and dad, are they? I mean, they're going to be like, hey, can we go over here and walk with so-and-so, right? Or maybe we can travel with uncle and aunt for a little while, or grandma and grandpa, or, whatever the case be. And so you probably would have children being shuffled back and forth through some of the ordinary actions of the day. And maybe, I don't know for sure, but maybe Mary was like most moms, and she was trying to enjoy a little bit of me time. If your child gets the opportunity to go away for a little while, you say, I love my child, but I appreciate a break every now and then. And so maybe that's not what she was caught up in thinking about. So anyway, they go to Jerusalem. They go through everything that happens. They set out on going back home, and I'm trying to picture in my mind, well, what do you think Mary was thinking about as they set off toward home? Well, I know what probably any ordinary mother would be thinking about. She'd be thinking about the load of laundry that she has to do whenever she gets home, right? All the stuff that you got to unpack. Knowing how you got to get the house back in order, you got to get everything prepared for the next day. And then you start thinking about your children, and you say, well, wait a minute. Where are my children? Where is Jesus anyway? And you start thinking, well, he's probably over here, with some of the other family. And you go over there and you start looking, he's not there. Well, maybe he's hanging out with some of his friends over here. So you go out and you investigate, and eventually you find out you've traveled a whole day. Okay, you've gone an entire day north of Jerusalem, and your child is missing. Now, I want you to think about that from the standpoint of a mother. What do you think was going through the mind of Mary? Well, there's no way that I can know for sure, but I imagine she was thinking about how Jesus, her child, is alone here at Jerusalem, and what are you going to do as a parent? Well, you're going to get back there as fast as you can, right? You're going to try to get back there. They've already been a day, so it's going to take them a day to get back. She's going to have an entire day to think about these things in her mind. And so I imagine as a mother, she was frantic. You think about Jesus, not only is Jesus lost, not only is her 12-year-old child lost here, but he's lost in a major city that's filled the max capacity because of the feast that's going on and everybody that's coming to the city at this time. Now imagine all those things were going through her mind as a mother. Now stop here for just a moment and ask the question, and include fathers here, have you ever lost your child before? And I don't mean for a day or two, maybe like Mary had, but have you ever lost your child just for a split second? Or maybe a minute? Or maybe even an hour? And through your own mind, you go through some of the things that Mary was thinking about and was going through. For 2 days, her child had been missing. And so I imagine that all of us can appreciate at least a little bit the panic that sets in your mind when you know that your child is missing. But it also has to do, I think, with the magnitude of the child that was missing here. Okay, Mary knew a little bit about Jesus, right? She knew that whenever she became pregnant, an angel appears to her and says, you're going to have a child. This is going to be a very special child that you're going to have. And then, of course, at the birth of Christ, you have the announcement of Christ's birth to the shepherds. This angel appears to them and announces it. And you read about how all at once there's this entire angelic host that's singing praises to God at the birth of this child. And these shepherds come and they visit with Mary and the child. Do you think they relayed that story to her? Well, I imagine they did. Read about the wise men. I studied that a week or two ago in our Sunday morning class that come from the east, that come from afar to worship Christ and bring these valuable gifts and give to Him. And so now you're thinking about all these things. You've lost your child, and I know that mothers aren't supposed to lose their children, any child, but you've lost the most important child that has ever been born on the face of the earth, and you know it. This is the Son of God. And so here's Mary sitting back with her husband to try to find Jesus. And it says in verse 46 there in Luke chapter 2, and it came to pass that after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, that is his parents, they were amazed. Well, we read about here, it took 3 days for Joseph and Mary to find Jesus. And I imagine those included the 2 days of travel. Imagine the first day they traveled and found out he wasn't there. Second day it took them to travel back. And then the third day, when they start looking, they finally find Jesus. But where would you go as a parent to find a lost child? Well, I can think, you'd probably go through the streets and the alleyways. And, you'd be looking for your son who is just beside himself, right? Full panic mode is set in. He's hysterically crying. He's out here and he's separated from his mother and his father, and he's lost, and it's been 3 days and he doesn't know where anybody is. I mean, I'd go to the local hospitals, I don't think they had police stations back there, but I would go to police stations and I would check and I would go to all the major places of commerce and trade and say, hey, have you seen this individual? Have you seen this young child? Probably the last place I'd look for my child, in the church building. But that's where Jesus was. He was in the temple. And so I don't know if they'd exhausted all these other possibilities, but they start searching in the temple, and there he is. And he's not over here in a corner, sulking and crying and pouting. He's sitting here right in the middle of all these biblical authorities and lawyers and scribes. And he's asking them questions, and then he's listening to the answers that they're giving to him. And then he's having a biblical discussion with them about these things that they're dwelling upon here. So, there he is right in the middle of all these people. Now, look at you can appreciate in verse 48 what it says. When they saw him, when his parents saw him, they're flabbergasted. Now, this was not what they expected at all. And then you look in the latter part of verse 48, it says, notice the reaction of Mary. His mother says unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrow. And he said unto them, How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? I don't know what Mary was feeling right there at that particular moment, but think about it from the standpoint of you and your child, okay? So if your child has been lost for 3 days, and here you find your child, and first of all, they're not even close to where you thought they would have been, but then they're not even acting like you thought they would have acted or reacted. They're just sitting there having the time of their life like nothing has gone wrong. That was Jesus. He was just enjoying himself. He was soaking up what was going on there. And so Mary's been, at least 2 days here beside herself. She's been anguishing. In fact, in verse 48, we read there how it says, she says, Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrow. This had been weighing, this had been dragging her down. New King James Version says very anxiously. Some other versions say with great distress, frantic, half out of our minds. Well, that's understandable as a parent. So you compare their emotional state with Jesus' emotional state. And there's a tremendous contrast between what they were feeling and experiencing and what Jesus was feeling and experiencing. And so Mary asked him the question in verse 48, at least the latter part, why'd you do this? Why have you acted like this? Why have you put your father and I through such a difficult time and situation? And I'm going to basically rough paraphrase of Jesus' statement here, but he says, what have y'all been out of shape about? What's the big fuss about? Why the big commotion? He said, why are you searching so frantically for me? How is it that you sought me like this? What's caused this situation? And then he kind of reacts, and as a parent, you might think, well, this is kind of a smart aleck reply here, but Jesus was very sincere in what he said. He said, why would you have a hard time finding me? Didn't you know that's where you should look? I mean, if you're going to look for a child, where's the first place you're going to look? You're going to look in the family home, aren't you? Why didn't you look in my father's house? Didn't you know that's where I'd be? Why were you so frantically running about and searching for me? And so to him, the obvious place to look first would have been the house of God. Now, it says in verse 50 there of Luke chapter 2, and they, Mary and Joseph, understood not the saying which he spake unto them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them. But his mother kept all these things in her heart. I wonder, the Bible doesn't record it, but I wonder how Mary reacted as a mother at that point. Where Jesus says, what have you been out of shape about? Why didn't you look here first? It's an obvious place. I don't know if she grabbed him by the ear and twisted it and, stuck him in the back of the ox cart and made him ride there the rest of the time home. What was the conversation like between a mother and a son, during that journey back to the city of Nazareth, that 70 miles? Well, I know from a child mother's standpoint what my conversation would have been like with a mother. I wouldn't have said a word. I wouldn't have said two words because I know that mom's a little mad right now. She just needs some time to calm down. Maybe by the time we get home, she'll be calm. But it's interesting, it says there in Luke 2 and verse 50, they didn't understand. They didn't understand what a 12-year-old boy would be talking about when he started talking about, why have you been out of shape? Where's the most obvious place to look for me? But I do think Mary knew this. I think in her mind, she knew that Jesus was quickly approaching manhood. There was a time that was quickly coming that she was going to have to say goodbye. All mothers understand that with their children. She was going to have to set him free. And I think she understood the importance of children needing their mothers. Mothers are there to nurture their children. Mothers are there to teach them and to guide them to a point where they're responsible enough to be released into the world. And I think that's what Mary as a mother, had tried to instill within Jesus as her child. And one day, if we haven't already, I know there's some children in the audience this morning. I'm still a child, but I'm not that young child anymore. But all of us know that one day we're going to leave the house of our mother, if we haven't already. And we're going to make a transition into the world, the modern day world. And we'll probably begin our own family in our own house. But ultimately, the goal is to get to God's house, isn't it? In all this training that parents do as a child, or do toward a child, that's what they're really pointing at whenever you think about teaching them maturity and teaching them responsibility. And I know when we look at our children, and we often look at mothers in particular, I think mothers are constantly driving, pushing their children to be successful. Whether it's in the job that they conduct here upon this world, whether it's being a father, whether it's being a husband, they always want success for their children. And they want it in this life, but more importantly than that, they want it in the next. That's what pushing children is really all about. It's about not just being successful in this day, in this world, but being successful in the next life. And you know what Jesus is telling his mother here? He's saying, excuse me, he's saying, this is what you've trained me for. You know, all this teaching and all this pushing and everything that you've done for me, this is what you've prepared me to be. Successful. Not just in the modern world, but in the house of my Father. And you know, when we think about today being Mother's Day, again, it's one of the days out of an entire year that we take some time to appreciate what mothers do for us. We just read that story about one event in the life of Mary. But think about all the energy she poured into her children. Think about all the time that she invested. Think about the tears. Think about the frustration, like we read about, that she experienced in the life of her children. But she poured all those things into them to make them what they were and to be successful. And that's something that we should honor. That's something that we should take some time out of our lives to respect what our mothers have done for us, the person that they've trained us and made us to be today. So I think it's good. I think it's good that we have a day like today in our society to reflect upon the many things that mothers do within our life. But as we're ending this morning, I always want to make the lesson a little bit personal in nature. And so we've talked about mothers, but I want you to think about this verse or these verses as we're ending this morning. Psalm 127 verses 3 and 4. It says, "Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth." It's an interesting illustration that the psalmist used here between parents and children. And again, we're going to relate it to mothers here. But parents are basically the bow. Okay, and it's the job of the bow. What do? Well, you put the arrow in the bow. You got to draw the bow back, and you got to point the bow in the right direction that you want the arrow to go. That's what children do, or what parents do for their children. You know, they train them up. The living children are the arrows. We point them in the direction that we want them to go, and then one day you've got to release that arrow, don't you? And you hope they follow the path that you put them upon. I like archery. I don't like it. Well, I like it because it's enjoyable, but I like it mainly because I get to hunt. And so that's my main interest, I guess, in archery. But one of the things that you learn as an archer is sometimes you can have the perfect form. You can do everything right. You can have your bow all in tune, and the arrow is bent a little and you can't see it. Or maybe there's, some kind of deformity in the arrow that's not detectable to your own eyes. And so you do everything right. You point the arrow in the direction you want it to go, but the arrow doesn't make it there. It's not because of something that you did. It's not because of the bow that you shot him out of. It's because of the arrow itself. And that's the personal application that I want for us to think about this morning. Did we fly the way we were supposed to fly? We talked about how all these things, our parents pour their life into us, and our mothers exert all this time and all this energy to make us successful in life and to make us what we should be. Did we turn out like we were supposed to? Not necessarily aiming at success in this life, but thinking about the next one. Are we going to make it to our Father's house? Are we going to be what God wants us to be and what our parents, our godly parents, trained us to be? And if not, do I have to look at myself as an arrow and say, where did I go wrong? My parents did all these things right, but somewhere along the line, I didn't do what I was supposed to do. So maybe that's your situation this morning. Maybe you're a person who needs to obey the gospel of Christ. Maybe your mom and dad taught you to do that. Maybe they pointed you in the right direction, but you just haven't done it yet. Maybe you're an erring child of God. Maybe you've already obeyed the gospel, but you've not been living faithfully like your mother or your father taught you to do. And maybe you need to make some changes in your life. Friends,